My name is Renata, and I was 32 years old the morning my younger sister sent me a text that said, and I quote, "You're too plain for the photos. Just stay home. You'll embarrass us." I read it standing at my kitchen counter, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. I didn't call her back. I didn't forward it to my mother. I set the phone face down, took one slow breath, and went to work. Here's what I want you to understand before I tell you the rest. I had been the quiet one in my family my entire life. The one who handled things. The one who made calls, signed paperwork, showed up early, and left late. And for my sister Danny's wedding, a wedding that had been in planning for 14 months, I had been the one doing all of that and more. Every contract, every deposit, every vendor relationship ran directly through me. None of them had stopped to ask whose name was actually on those documents. By the time the florist called Danny the week before the ceremony, that oversight had already cost my family something they were not prepared to lose. To understand what happened at Danny's wedding, you need to understand what our family looked like from the outside versus what it actually was on the inside, because those two pictures were almost nothing alike. From the outside, we looked like a close, functional family. My parents, Jean and Miriam, had been married for 38 years. They lived in the same house in Naperville, Illinois, where my sister and I had grown up, a brick colonial on a quiet street with a covered porch and a garden my mother tended obsessively every spring. Danny, my younger sister by 4 years, was 28, recently engaged to a man named Theo, whose family owned a small chain of hospitality businesses in the western suburbs. Theo was pleasant enough. His parents, Frank and Carolyn, were the kind of people who wore the right clothes to the right events and cared very much about how things appeared. And then there was me. I was 32, single, and I worked as a contracts administrator for a mid-sized commercial construction firm in downtown Chicago. I had been doing that work for 8 years. Before that, I'd put myself through 2 years of paralegal coursework at night while working full-time as an office manager for a property management company. I am not telling you this to brag. I am telling you because it matters to what came later. I understood contracts the way some people understand recipes, intuitively, thoroughly, and with an awareness of every place where something could go wrong. My apartment was a one-bedroom in Evanston. Nothing impressive. I drove a 6-year-old Civic and packed my lunch most days and had a savings account that my family knew nothing about, because in our family, money was something you performed rather than accumulated. My mother had always believed in looking prosperous. My father had always believed in deferring to my mother. And Danny had always believed that she was the one in the family who deserved nice things, because she was the younger one, the prettier one, the one who had always been easiest to love. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it as a plain observation of the family dynamics I had been navigating since I was about 8 years old. Our father's mother, our grandmother Etta, was the one adult in my childhood who treated me as though I was fully real. Grandma Etta was 79, sharp as a tack, and had worked as a bookkeeper for a manufacturing company for 31 years before she retired. She lived alone in a condo in Schaumburg and called me every Sunday morning, without fail. She used to say, "Renata, the person who understands the paperwork always has the upper hand. Always. Don't ever let anyone convince you to hand that over." I had taken that advice more seriously than she probably intended. When Danny got engaged 18 months before the wedding, the family went into immediate and total celebration mode. Theo proposed in a restaurant with a photographer present, which was very on-brand for both of them. Within a week, my mother had pulled out a notepad and begun listing venues. Within 2 weeks, it was clear that the budget my parents had in mind and the wedding Danny wanted were not going to be reconcilable without some kind of bridge. My parents had set aside roughly $40,000 over the years for what my mother called the girls' futures, though in practice that fund had always been discussed in relation to Danny, whose milestones seemed to arrive louder and with more ceremony than mine. I had never been told explicitly that the money was not for me, but I had also never been under any illusion that it was. The problem was that $40,000 in the current market in the western Chicago suburbs, with Theo's family expecting a certain caliber of event, was not going to get anyone very far. The venue Danny had fallen in love with, a restored estate property called Whitmore Gardens in Hinsdale, had a base rental fee of $18,000. Catering quotes were coming in between 12 and 16,000 for their guest count of 90. Photography packages started at 8. Florals, which Danny cared about deeply and specifically, were going to run somewhere between 6 and 9,000 depending on complexity. The numbers were not adding up. This is where I came in. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I don't want you to think I swept in and offered to fund the wedding as some kind of generous gesture. That is not what happened. What happened was more gradual and more practical than that. Danny and my mother were struggling to coordinate vendor communications, to read contracts carefully, to keep track of deposit deadlines and cancellation windows and liability clauses. My mother called me one evening in late January, about 13 months before the wedding date, and said, "Renata, you're good at this kind of thing. Can you just help us get organized?" I said yes, because that is what I do. I am good at this kind of thing. I drove out to Naperville on a Saturday, sat at the kitchen table with a stack of vendor packets and my laptop, and spent 6 hours reading through every document. I flagged 17 issues across 4 contracts. Wrong dates, missing liability waivers, deposit structures that would leave my family exposed if anything changed. I called 2 vendors on behalf of my parents that same afternoon to renegotiate terms. By the end of that Saturday, my mother looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "What would we do without you?" And I smiled and said, "You'd figure it out," and I drove home. What shifted over the following weeks was this. The vendors started calling me. Not my mother. Not Danny. Me, because I was the one who had spoken with them professionally, who had returned calls promptly, who had sent follow-up emails that were clear and organized and legally coherent. The florist, a woman named Petra who ran a boutique called Stem and Stone out of Western Springs, called me directly when she had a question about the deposit structure. The catering coordinator at a company called Ardent Provisions called me when they needed confirmation on the menu tasting date. The venue coordinator at Whitmore Gardens sent all correspondence to my email. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, and I want to be honest with you about this because I don't think I fully understood what I was doing at the time, the contract started getting signed in my name. Not because anyone asked me to assume legal responsibility, but because I was the one on the phone, the one sending the emails, the one who showed up to the venue walkthrough because Danny had a conflict and my mother didn't want to go alone, and then also ended up having a conflict. I was the one who sat across from the Whitmore Gardens coordinator and signed the rental agreement. I was the one who wired the deposit from my own checking account, $18,000, because my parents' check had bounced due to a bank processing delay and the venue needed payment by end of business to hold the date. "We'll pay you back this weekend," my mother said. "No rush," I said, because I had the money and the date needed to be held, and that was the practical solution. They paid me back $12,000. The remaining $6,000 was never mentioned again. I did not bring it up. This is the pattern I am describing to you. Not dramatic. Not a single big moment of exploitation. Just a gradual accumulation of tasks, responsibilities, signatures, and unreimbursed expenses that settled onto my shoulders so quietly that by the time the wedding was 4 months out, I was functionally the wedding planner, the contracts manager, and the primary financial backer for an event I had never once been asked if I wanted to help fund. My name was on the venue contract. My name was on the florist contract, $6,800 for ceremony arch florals, reception centerpieces, bridal party arrangements, and welcome installation. My name was on the catering contract with Ardent Provisions, $14,200, with a signed rider for the bar package. My name was on the photography contract, $8,500 for a full-day package with a second shooter. And my name was on the rental agreement for the specialty linen and tableware company, another $4,600. Total, across all vendors, $34,100. With my signature on every single document. Danny knew I was helping. My parents knew I was helping. No one had ever sat down with me and looked at the full picture of what that help actually meant, legally and financially. And I, for reasons I have examined many times since, had never forced that conversation. I had just kept showing up, kept signing, kept holding the thing together with both hands and saying it was fine. The uninvitation, because that is the only word for what it was, came in stages. That is the part that made it particularly hard to process, not because the end result was surprising, but because each individual step was presented so reasonably. The first step was a conversation with my mother about 5 months before the wedding. She called on a Wednesday evening and told me that Theo's parents had expressed some preferences about the wedding party. Frank and Carolyn apparently had a vision of the ceremony aesthetic that involved a very specific look, coordinated, polished. Editorial was the word my mother used. Theo had 2 sisters, both of whom were going to be bridesmaids. Danny had 2 close friends from college who were also in the party. That was 4 attendants. The original plan had included me as the 5th. We're thinking of keeping the party smaller, my mother said. More streamlined. Carolyn mentioned that an even number photographs better. There were always going to be 5 bridesmaids, I said. I know, but Theo's side only has 2, so it feels lopsided. And honestly, Renata, you've been doing so much behind the scenes. Maybe it makes more sense for you to be a guest. You'd be more relaxed. You could actually enjoy the day. I remember the specific sensation of that conversation, something going very still in my chest, like a clock stopping. I was standing in my kitchen in Evanston, holding the phone, looking at the traffic moving past on the street below my window. I'll think about it, I said. I did not get a chance to finish thinking about it because 2 weeks later my mother called again and said the decision had been made. Danny had agreed that a smaller party would feel more cohesive, and they hoped I understood. And wasn't it actually nicer to sit in the front row as a guest than to have to manage all the logistics of being in the party? I said I understood. Because in my family, saying you understood was always the path of least resistance, and I had been walking that path for 32 years. The second step came about 6 weeks later. I had agreed to attend the engagement dinner at Frank and Carolyn's house in Burr Ridge, a dinner I had not been consulted about in terms of timing, despite the fact that I had rearranged a work commitment to attend. When I arrived, I found that the seating arrangement placed me at the far end of the table, away from the family cluster, next to Theo's college roommate who had driven in from Milwaukee and seemed to know no one. Every family photo that was taken that evening featured my parents, Danny, Theo, and Theo's parents and sisters in various configurations. I was not in any of them, not because I was excluded explicitly, but because no one came to find me when the photos were being taken. I ate my dinner. I made conversation with a roommate from Milwaukee who turned out to be a structural engineer and very interesting to talk to. I drove home at 9:30. The third step, and this was the one that made the shape of things fully clear, was a conversation with Danny herself, about 10 weeks before the wedding. We met for lunch at a cafe in Oak Park, and I was genuinely glad to see her, because despite everything, she was my sister, and I loved her in the tired, complicated way you love someone who has always taken you for granted without meaning to. We talked about the venue setup, the menu, the floral installation she was most excited about. Petra at Stem and Stone had designed a ceremony arch with white garden roses, hanging amaranth, and eucalyptus that Danny had been dreaming about for months. I had been the one on the phone with Petra for 6 separate consultations. I had approved the final design mock-up. I knew every bloom in that arrangement by name. At the end of the lunch, Danny set her coffee cup down and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not make it a whole thing." I looked at her. Okay. Carolyn asked if you're going to be at the rehearsal dinner. And, okay, so Frank and Carolyn are hosting it at their house, and it's supposed to be really intimate, just immediate family and the wedding party. And since you're not in the party anymore, it's kind of, she stopped. Restarted. It would just be a little awkward to explain why you're there if you're not in the party, or in the immediate family. Like, to Theo's sisters. They don't know you well. I looked at my coffee. My hands were very still on the table. I am immediate family, I said. I'm your sister. I know. Danny's voice was careful. But Carolyn means immediate family on both sides, like the nuclear unit. And with the party the way it is now, it would be a little uneven. Mom thought it might be easier if you just came to the wedding itself and skipped the rehearsal dinner. Mom thought, I repeated. We all talked about it. It's just a logistical thing, Renata. It's not a big deal. The phrase, we all talked about it, landed somewhere behind my sternum. My jaw was tight. I unclenched it carefully. All right, I said. You're not mad. I'm not mad. I said. And I wasn't exactly. What I was something I didn't have a clean word for. Something that had been building for 13 months of showing up and signing things and being quietly essential and just as quietly set aside. The final step, the text message, arrived 4 days before the wedding. I want to give you the context because context matters. I had been in contact with every vendor that week for final confirmations. I had spoken with the Whitmore Gardens coordinator about the setup timeline. I had confirmed the catering headcount with Arden Provisions. I had texted Petra at Stem and Stone to confirm delivery and installation time for the floral pieces. I was, in every functional sense, still running the operational side of this wedding, despite having been excluded from every social element of it. On the morning of that Wednesday, I received a text from Danny. Not a call, a text. It read, "Hey, so Carolyn looked through the photo plan with a photographer, and she thinks having you in any of the family portrait shots would look weird since you're not in the party. Can you just plan to sit with the general guests? Also, honestly, if you need to come to the cocktail hour either, it's kind of a family and party thing. You could just come for dinner." I stared at that for a long time. Then my mother sent a follow-up text that read, "Renata, your sister talked to me. You're too plain for the photos, just stay home. You'll embarrass us. We need this day to be perfect for Carolyn's sake. You understand." I want to pause on that for a moment because I want you to really hear what was said. Not the theatrical version. Not the movie villain version. The quiet, kitchen table, reasonable voice version. "You're too plain, just stay home. You understand." Said by my mother, about her own daughter. For days before a wedding I had spent 14 months holding together. My throat was tight. My face felt very flat, like all the expression had gone out of it. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. Then I opened my laptop. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do in the days between that text and the wedding. I did not cancel anything. I did not call any vendor and pull the contracts. I did not send an angry reply to my mother or to Danny. I did not tell my grandmother Etta what had happened, though she called that Sunday as always and I spoke with her for 40 minutes about her neighbor's new dog and the book she was reading and whether the spring had been warm enough for her peonies. What I did was think. I had been so focused on the operational reality of the wedding, on the fact that I held every contract, that my name was the legally binding name on every document, that I had never once sat down and thought carefully about what that actually meant, what it gave me, and whether I had ever intended to use it. I thought about it now. I thought about it for 3 days. I am a contracts administrator. I understand, better than most people, that a signature is not a formality. A signature is a legal commitment. It specifies who holds the relationship with the vendor, who has the authority to modify or terminate that relationship, and who bears the financial and logistical consequences if that relationship changes. My name on every one of those contracts was not a detail. It was the structural fact on which the entire event rested. I also knew because I had read every contract carefully multiple times because that is what I do, exactly what the cancellation and modification terms said. And I knew that the window for several of those contracts was still open because I had negotiated longer modification windows specifically to protect my family from last-minute changes. A provision I had included thoughtfully, professionally, on behalf of people who had just texted me to stay home because I was too plain. I thought about my grandmother's voice. The person who understands the paperwork always has the upper hand. I thought about 14 months of showing up. I thought about the text from my mother. And then on the morning of the wedding, I want to be exact about the sequence. I sent 2 emails. One to Petra at Stem and Stone. One to the Whitmore Gardens venue coordinator. Not cancellation notices. Not yet. Just a note from the contract holder asking each of them to confirm, at the event, that all authorizations and any last-minute decisions would need to go through me, as I was the signatory of record. A standard, professional communication. The kind of thing a contracts administrator sends when they need to establish a clear chain of authority at a live event. Then I got dressed. I put on a dark green midi dress I had bought 2 years ago and rarely wore. Quiet, well-fitted, nothing flashy. I drove to Hinsdale. I parked in the lot at Whitmore Gardens. And I went inside. I had every right to be there. My name was on the venue contract. Technically speaking, I was the most legally present person in the building. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. I arrived at 3:15. The floral installation was complete, and it was breathtaking. Petra's team had executed the ceremony arch exactly as designed. White garden roses, dense and lush, amaranth hanging in long burgundy curtains, eucalyptus trailing down the sides. 12 months of phone calls and consultations, visible and real, and standing in front of me. I found a seat near the back of the ceremony space. I nodded to two of my parents' friends who recognized me. I watched my mother come in on my father's arm and take her place in the front row without looking back to see if I was there. The ceremony was 25 minutes. Danny was beautiful. That is a plain fact, and I state it without complication. She was beautiful, and she was happy, and Theo looked at her the way everyone hopes someone will look at them. I watched the whole thing from the back row, and felt something I am still not sure I can fully name, something layered and quiet, and not entirely unkind. Then the ceremony ended, and the guests began moving toward the cocktail reception in the garden, and that is when I saw Petra. Petra from Stem and Stone was standing near the entrance to the reception hall with her site coordinator, a clipboard in hand, running through the breakdown schedule for the floral pieces. She saw me, recognized me immediately. We had spoken on the phone probably 20 times over the past year, and walked over. Renata. She shook my hand warmly. Everything looked beautiful, I think. It really did, I said. Exactly what we planned. Petra's expression shifted slightly. Something careful came into her eyes. I want to let you know, I got your email this morning. About authorization. She paused. Mrs. Miriam, your mother, she came to me about an hour ago. She wanted to make a change to the breakdown schedule, move the arch pieces to a different storage arrangement. I told her I needed to confirm with you first. My mother, standing about 15 feet away with a glass of champagne, had noticed this conversation. I could see her become very still. What did she say to that? I asked. She said she was the mother of the bride, and that should be sufficient. Petra's voice was professionally neutral. I explained that the contract is in your name, and that per the terms, all authorizations need to come from the signatory of record. My mother set her champagne glass down on a nearby table. Her face, which had been arranged in a hostess smile all afternoon, went very smooth. She walked toward us. Renata. Her voice was controlled. What are you doing? I'm talking to Petra, I said. She had a question about the floral authorization. I told her I'm the mother of the bride. I know, I said, but the contract is in my name. My mother's eyes were very flat. We can talk about this later. I don't think we need to, I said. Petra just needed to know who to check with. Now she knows. That was the freeze beat. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just my mother standing in the garden of Whitmore Gardens with her champagne abandoned on a table, understanding, for the first time, really understanding, that the foundation she had been standing on for 14 months had a name on it. And it was not hers. The reveal, when it came, was not something I engineered. I want to be honest about that. I did not stage it. I did not arrange for an audience. The audience assembled itself, the way audiences at family events always do, because people gravitate toward tension, and tension is something you can feel in a room even when no one is raising their voice. Dinner was called at 6:30. 90 guests filed into the reception hall, the long tables draped in the ivory linens I had selected, the centerpieces Petra's team had arranged, the candlelight I had approved through 3 rounds of venue consultations. Danny and Theo were at the head table with their parents. I was at a table near the middle of the room, as a general guest, as instructed. I had been seated next to a woman named Harriet, who turned out to be Carolyn's older sister, visiting from out of state. Harriet was in her mid-60s, dry, funny, and very direct. We talked through the salad course about her work as a retired family law mediator, and I found I liked her a great deal. At some point during the main course, the Whitmore Gardens venue coordinator, a composed woman in her early 40s named Becca, came into the reception hall and made her way to the head table. I watched her speak quietly to my father, who looked at her with some confusion, then looked toward my mother. My mother's expression tightened. Becca shook her head, once, calmly, and gestured in my direction. My father looked across the room at me. I met his eyes. I gave a small nod. Becca walked across the reception hall toward my table. The room was not silent. The band was between sets. There was the sound of glassware and conversation, but the head table had gone quiet, and quiet travels. By the time Becca reached me, Carolyn had turned in her chair to watch. Theo's father Frank had turned as well. My mother was sitting with her hands flat on the tablecloth. "Ms. Renata," Becca said, with the same professional composure she had maintained throughout every interaction we'd had. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner. We have a question about the final payment authorization for the venue balance. The remaining deposit installment of $4,200 was flagged. The card on file is yours, and we need verbal confirmation from the signatory to process tonight, per the contract terms." Harriet, seated next to me, set her fork down. "Of course," I said. "I can confirm that. And we also have a small matter from the catering team. Arden Provisions sent over a final headcount adjustment invoice for 2 additional guests added last week. It's $360. Again, the account is in your name, so they need your sign-off." The table nearest to mine had gone quiet. 2 of Theo's college friends, seated there, were looking over. The band was still between sets. From across the room, my mother said, not loudly, but in the particular carrying voice she used when she was trying to maintain authority, "Becca, I can handle the billing. I'm the mother of the bride." Becca turned toward her, unhurried and politely immovable. "I understand, Mrs. Miriam. But per the contract, the signatory of record is Renata. All final authorizations need to come from her." "I don't understand why Renata is on the contracts," my mother said. And there it was, the question that had never been asked, the stone that had been sitting in the middle of the road for 14 months that everyone had simply walked around. Becca looked at her, then looked at me. I gave a small nod. "The venue rental agreement, the catering contract, the floral services contract, the photography package, and the linen and tableware rental are all signed by Renata," Becca said, with the patient clarity of someone reading from an official document, because she was reading from an official document. She had the folder in her hand. "The total value of contracted services across those agreements is $34,100. All liability, authorization, and financial responsibility rests with the signatory." The number landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. $34,100. Carolyn's hand stopped moving. Frank set his wine glass down. My mother's face had gone very white. Danny, at the head table, had turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on her before, something stripped and unsteady, like a person who has just realized the floor they've been standing on is not the floor they thought it was. Harriet, beside me, made a quiet sound that was not quite a word. "Is that—" my father started. Stopped. "All of it. All of the vendor contracts, yes," Becca said pleasantly. She closed the folder. "Renata, would you like to step to the side to confirm the payment authorization? It will only take a moment." "Of course," I said. I stood, set my napkin on the chair, and followed Becca toward the venue's side office. I did not look at my mother as I walked past. I did not look at Danny. I looked at the centerpieces, which were exactly as beautiful as I had known they would be, with the candles sending light up through the stems of the white roses. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. In the side office, I confirmed the payment. I signed off on the headcount adjustment. Becca thanked me with genuine warmth and said that working with me had been, in her words, the most organized vendor process we've had in 2 years. I said I was glad to hear it. Then I went back to my table, sat down, and finished my dinner. The rest of the reception happened around me the way weather happens. I was present inside it, but the storm was forming somewhere else. Harriet leaned toward me during the dessert course and said, very quietly, "How long have you been managing all of that?" 14 months, I said. She made a short sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else. "And they put you at the general tables." "They did," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "My sister's going to have a very interesting evening." She was not wrong. I watched, from my middle table with the excellent view, as the conversations at the head table shifted and reconfigured over the following hour. Carolyn spoke at length with Frank, their heads close together. My father spoke to my mother with the particular set of his jaw that meant he was asking questions he should have asked a long time ago. Danny spoke to no one for a stretch of time that seemed very long for a bride at her own reception. Theo, to his credit, came and found me during the dancing portion of the evening. He crouched down beside my chair, which was a somewhat graceless thing to do in a tuxedo, and I respected him for it, and said, "Renata, I didn't know. I genuinely did not know any of this." "I know," I said. "That's the whole thing. All of it." "Yes." He looked at the tablecloth. His jaw was tight. "I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say." "You don't need to say anything," I said. "Congratulations. It really was a beautiful wedding." He looked at me with something complicated in his eyes, stood up, and went back to his wife. My mother found me near the end of the evening, by the coat check, as guests were beginning to leave. She had the look she gets when she has been crying, but is not going to admit to it, a particular flatness around her eyes, a careful stillness in her face. "Renata," she said, "we need to talk about all of this." "All right," I said. "You could have told us. You could have said something. We didn't realize the contracts were in your name." I looked at her. "You didn't ask," I said. Her mouth opened. Closed. "We need to sit down and sort out the finances. The money you're owed." "I'm not owed anything," I said. "I chose to help. Every step of the way, I chose it. I just think it would have been nice if someone had asked, at any point in 14 months, whether I was all right." My mother's eyes were very bright. "We assumed you were fine." "I know you did," I said. And then, because 14 months of patience deserved at least one honest sentence, that was the problem. I got my coat. I said goodnight to Harriet, who squeezed my hand and said, "Well done, sweetheart." Quiet is sometimes the loudest thing in the room. I nodded to Becca and her team on my way out. I found my car in the lot. I drove north on I-294 with the windows down and the radio on low, something instrumental, nothing I could name, and by the time I got back to Evanston the wedding was over. I made a cup of tea. I sat at my kitchen counter in the dark, with the city lights coming through the window, and I thought about the way the candlelight had looked in those white roses. In the days that followed, the calls came. My mother called 3 times the morning after the wedding. I let the first 2 go to voicemail. I answered the third. She wanted to talk about the outstanding financial balance, the $6,000 still unreimbursed from the original venue deposit, and what she now understood to be a broader pattern of expenses I had absorbed without fanfare. She was careful and measured on the phone, which told me that she had slept on it and recalibrated. "We want to make this right," she said. "I'm not asking you to make anything right," I said. "I'd just like to be treated as a full member of this family going forward." There was a pause. "Of course you are." "Then let's start from there," I said. Danny called on the day after that. The conversation was different from any conversation we had ever had, because for the first time in our adult lives, she did not know where she stood with me, and she knew it. "I didn't think about what you were actually doing," she said. "I just thought you liked helping." I said I did like helping. I said the issue was not the helping. She said she understood. I thought she probably did for the first time. Carolyn's response was the one that surprised me most. A week after the wedding, I received a handwritten note from her in the mail. Not an email, a note, on stationery with her initials on it. She thanked me for what she called the extraordinary care and professionalism I had brought to the planning of her son's wedding. She said she had not understood the situation, and that had she known, things would have been arranged very differently. She said she hoped we would have the opportunity to know each other properly. It was a generous note. I put it on my desk and looked at it for a while. My father called last, which was typical of him. He was the one who needed the most time to organize his thoughts. He spoke for about 15 minutes, carefully and seriously, about accountability and about the things families take for granted. It was probably the most direct conversation he and I had ever had. At the end of it, he said, "You should have been in those photos, Renata." I said, "Yes, Dad. I should have." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." And I meant it on both sides. The financial piece was resolved over the following month. My mother and father reimbursed me for the original $6,000, and after reviewing everything, they identified several other expenses I had absorbed: transportation, consultation fees I had paid to a floral designer early in the process, a venue insurance rider I had quietly added to protect everyone. It came to a bit over $9,000 total. They paid it. I accepted it without drama, because it was simply owed. The social standing question settled itself, the way these things do, through the quiet repositioning of a family's internal hierarchy. Carolyn invited me to a small dinner at her house in Burr Ridge 6 weeks after the wedding. She seated me next to Frank and spoke to me as an equal throughout the evening. Danny watched this happen with the specific expression of someone recalculating a long-held assumption. My mother, to her credit, said nothing and refilled my wine glass without being asked. Harriet sent me a text 3 weeks after the wedding that said simply, "Mediators know a fair outcome when we see one." I saved that one. Here is what I have come to believe. In the year since all of this happened, the problem was never that my family didn't love me. The problem was that love, without attention, becomes assumption. And assumption, held long enough, becomes invisibility. I had been invisible in my family for a very long time. Not cruelly, not maliciously, but genuinely, thoroughly invisible, and the only thing that made me visible again was a simple legal fact. My name was on the paperwork. I don't think that's the way it should work. I think people should be seen because they matter, not because they're the signatory of record on a $34,000 contract portfolio. But sometimes the paperwork is what you have. And sometimes it's enough. My grandmother Etta called the Sunday after the wedding, as she always does. I told her what had happened, the whole thing from the text message to the venue coordinator to Harriet's note. She listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I told you. The person who understands the paperwork always has the upper hand." "You were right," I said. "I'm always right," she said. "I'm 79 years old. I've earned it." I laughed for the first time in about a week. That's my story. A laptop, a contract folder, and 14 months of quiet work. I want to ask you something before I go, because this one has stayed with me. Has there ever been a time when you quietly held something together for people who didn't know, or didn't think to ask, what it cost you? And if so, what finally made them see it? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.